because they're watching the CrossFit Games, whether or not there's one African on the floor or there's 15, right? They're still going to watch. And so you need more opportunities in an area to compete. You need more experienced coaches. So I think having, if they really wanted to improve it, it's like, hey, how can we get an experienced CrossFit Games athlete or coach to develop a mentorship role, whether it's in person or online with more of those gyms? How can we develop a series of competitions that allow people of similar calibers to compete against each other in those areas? So instead of maybe 20 people taking the sport seriously in a city, it becomes 200, it becomes 2,000. And then from that, you'll get the cream rising to the top, and the best will become even better than the best were when there was just 20. So that's how you improve a sport in an area, not by, pandering to them and saying, oh, here's one more spot, or, we're going to protect the spot that you have. I just don't think that functionally works long term.
And there's almost like this, maybe not unintended, but this benefit to where if someone does do that and go down and take that spot, if there's like this sense of national pride or regional pride that is implied with this rule, I almost feel like that will fire those people up to be like, no, like that's our spot. Like that's something that we want to keep here. And when you see that person training or you're around that person, you're like, hey, like not only am I getting exposure to someone that from a more powerful region that's coming down and training and maybe helping plant seeds in that direction, I'm also seeing firsthand in this gym, day in and day out.
What it takes.
That stirs it up. And I think we overlook that a little bit. And I also think that, there's so much that goes into the development process of these regions that at very least, the default of the like bad scenario is someone is like ingrained in that community by physically being there. I think that's better than the alternative.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I can't, I went to Egypt for a competition, and I didn't go there as like a charity thing, right? I went there because I wanted to do the competition and I wanted to travel to Egypt because I wanted to see the pyramids, right? So that's why I went. But in the process, I keep in touch with Ruan, who finished third at semifinals. Mm-hmm. I keep in touch with Cavio. We now share the same coach. He's from Egypt. He's one of the best athletes in Egypt. And, I think I've played maybe like a small role in their development. And not to mention, I had a lot of people say when I was there competing in Egypt, like it was great to see me, how seriously I took my warm-ups, and just watching me do the workouts, watching me compete, even watching me train in the weeks leading up. They're like, oh, like that's kind of what it takes. He takes it really seriously, and he, puts a lot of preparation into it. And there's just like, and I remember that watching when I was young, seeing a professional beach volleyball player for the first time, watching him play, and it blew my mind how fast he was moving. And, and they said, they're like, we watch you at the games, but to see it in person is like a totally different thing. And that, I remember that as a young player watching, professional volleyball athletes, when I was 17, I'm like, this is blowing my mind, because I've seen them on YouTube, but it's not the same.
Yeah.
You watch them in person, it's totally different. And so to me, and like, I empathize with I would, in a perfect world, I would 100% prefer if it's someone who has an African passport, who's lived there their whole life, who represents there, that is representing Africa at the games. Like, yes. But in the interest of having more people participate in the sport, and if someone, moves there for a job and they just move there because they want to compete and they take that spot, yeah, it's not ideal in some principled fashion, but I think given the alternative, I think it's better. And I think long-term it could improve the quality of, among other steps. That's not the only step, but there are other things as well combined with that would improve the sport in that area.
So then when it comes to finding a system that works better, both for the athletes and the growth of the sport, is there anything tangible that the PFAA can do to help make progress with CrossFit? Or what does that conversation and those steps look like right now?
Yeah, and so something like this situation with Ellie, I've given it a lot of thought, and there's other things we're working on as well, PFA, but how can I word this? These are the types of situations, historically, why, the PFA was started, right? To try to converse with competitions like CrossFit to, hopefully have better rules that take into consideration the athletes and their needs, and then ensure the rules are being, followed effectively. So these are the types of things that an athlete association exists for. And so it's frustrating that we are not in a place where we can like tangibly make a difference in this specific situation, right? So on the one hand, someone would say, well, what good is the PFA if they can't, help Ellie, let's say? And maybe they're right. But, I remember 5 years ago, something like this would happen and someone would say, oh, this is why we need an athlete association. So like, at least we have one, but it's just not in a place yet where we can force change, right? And that takes leverage, right? It takes, more athletes buying into what we've got going on. And then it's a two-way street, right? It takes some leverage to convince CrossFit or we look at what Wodapalooza did and, they kind of welcomed us in because they understood the value of having athletes that are bought into the system and believe in it and, want to be part of the process to make competitions better. And so hopefully, CrossFit can kind of continue to, bring us in. And I will say this, over the past few years, speaking with people from CrossFit, like I used to have this mentality that sometimes they would do things, make decisions with like, what's the word, like ill intent or maliciously. And sometimes I would get to kind of peek behind the curtain and they'd give me an example or, explain their rationale for making certain decisions. And you'd understand, like I just assumed this. And then when I've given your point of view and, the facts that you have, I understand now why you made that decision. And whether or not maybe I like completely agree with it, I still think it was like a well-founded, good decision based on good principles and not as, mischievous as some people might claim that it is. But that happens with communication, right? And, like another example, like in 2021 in May, Victor from Sweden, his team was disqualified and they were frustrated because they felt they gave all the information required to have a team. And CrossFit said, no, it's not good enough. And they're like, well, what else do you need? And it's like, well, it's just not good enough. They're like, we've given you everything you've asked for from the rule book. Yeah, but you can fake that. And it's like, well, what are we doing then? Right. And so like, there's situations like that it's like, well, if the person followed your rules and they're saying they're telling the truth and you're saying they're not, and I wasn't privy to look at all the documents and they're not going to send them to me, but the people from that gym were still left feeling like, what did we do wrong? Like, I don't really understand. And so I'm sure there's some information that I'm not aware of. Right. Mm-hmm. And they came to that conclusion. They certainly didn't come to it lightly, but we're still left wondering like, okay, it's frustrating that someone's season ended and they're not really sure why.
Yeah, that was a tough one. And I felt like I got to see some of those documents and it felt like in that scenario, they were just shy of like the threshold of what you needed specifically. Right. But that's a whole nother can of worms.
Yeah.
But I mean, even touching on that, there is a history of some of these eligibility requirements. And I know you did your prep. So I want to hear I want to get the professor's history lesson and why and how it relates to the current scenario and where you feel, because there are some things you mentioned earlier about how it was applied to Ellie versus others that I want to pick your brain on after too.
Yeah. So basically, the Open started in 2011, and so from 2011 to 2018, as an individual athlete competing in the sport, which regional that you went to was solely based on, from what I could dig up and from my own personal memory, it's just which gym did you do the Open at? At the first week of the Open, which affiliate were you at? Or if you weren't at an affiliate, where did you do the workout, like geographically? And that's your region. And then during that window of time, if you were on a team of 6, team of 4, it was the same kind of thing. It's like, where is your affiliate? But the requirements were a little more stringent. So I think in 2011 and 2012, they weren't as firm. And then they realized people, like, let's say there's like a large city and there's 10 gyms. They're kind of making these super teams within the city, saying like, yeah, we all go to CrossFit downtown Sydney or something. And were they really training there? And so in 2013, they started to tighten up the rules, and they were basically, it was like this 50%. It's like you have to prove during a certain number of weeks over the year that 50% of your training or, 4 or 3 days a week of your training are done at that gym. You need photo and video evidence. And there were always instances of gyms, getting penalties that they didn't feel were fair, or were getting away with penalties that other teams felt were unfair. I remember an example of an athlete from America, and there were photos of that person, being on like a tour, whether it was an affiliate thing, or they were putting on seminars or family, but they were away during that window for like 2 weeks, I think in Japan or Korea. And then they were still allowed to compete on the team. And it's like, well, by the letter of the rule, yeah, they're on vacation, they're on a work trip, but by the letter of the rule, they didn't do 50% of their training during those 2 weeks at the affiliate in America, but they still got to compete. And I remember, teams from Australia that I was kind of familiar with because I competed there felt like they were, penalized and not able to compete